Hi everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're listening to this webinar. A very warm welcome to everyone who joins us today for this interesting webinar. I'm Caroline Hermans. I'm the Executive Director of the Netherland-America Foundation. For over 100 years, the NAF, the Netherland-America Foundation, has strengthened and promoted the bonds between the US and the Netherlands. We do this through educational, cultural, and business exchanges. We have co-hosted these annual historic webinars for 4 years now with the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm very proud of this partnership. I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar about a very relevant and timely topic. And it's an honor to have Craig Wilder as our speaker today. A very warm welcome to you. And thank you for being part of our NAF RIAS webinar. I believe our moderator is better suited to provide a proper introduction for Greg. So I would now like to introduce today's moderator and Executive Director of the Roosevelt Institute, Damien Pargas. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to welcome you and our distinguished guest, Professor Craig Stephen Wilder from MIT, to this 4th annual webinar jointly hosted by the RIAS, the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in the Netherlands, and the Netherland-America Foundation in the United States. My name is Damien Pargas. I am a professor of North American history at Leiden University, also in the Netherlands, and I'm specialized in the history of slavery. And I'm also the executive director of the RIAS. So the RIAS, for those of you who don't know us, is a research institute, an archive and a conference center that's formally affiliated with Leiden University. And we organize conferences and events that deal with all kinds of aspects of US history and transatlantic relations. But we also invest in public outreach, especially here in the province of Zeeland, where the RIAS is located. And each year we host these kinds of public lectures, webinars, and workshops that are specifically aimed at stimulating public discourse on issues that affect both American and Dutch society. And it almost goes without saying that the history of slavery currently constitutes a major theme in public discourse in the US and here in the Netherlands. In the past couple of years, we've witnessed a real reckoning with slavery that I think is unique in contemporary history. But we've also seen a backlash against that reckoning, both in the US and the Netherlands. And so expert voices are needed more than ever. It's with this in mind that the RIAS and the NAF sought to organize this webinar this year. This month, the month of October, is Black Achievement Month in the Netherlands, kind of like Black History Month in the US. So throughout the country here, there are all kinds of seminars and activities planned related to Black history and Black culture. And Zeeland province, where the RIAS is located, has a specific interest in the history of slavery in the Americas. Obviously, this province has a long history of slave trading and development of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, but also in mainland North America. And public discussions about slavery and the legacies of slavery are front and center here at this moment. There are currently even advanced plans to establish an educational center on the history of slavery in Zeeland's provincial capital, Middelburg. But one topic that we have not really explored much in detail in all of our slavery-related activities in the past couple of years is the historical role that education and educational institutions have played in the development of slavery. And that's what Professor Wilder is going to talk to us a little bit about today. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the NAF. As always, it's a pleasure to organize these webinars with you, as well as to Professor Wilder for taking time out of his busy schedule to teach us more about this important chapter of our shared history today. So thank you both very much. I will properly introduce Professor Wilder. Craig Stephen Wilder is the Barton L. Weller Professor of History at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. He is the author of Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, which was published back in 2013. It's a book I highly recommend to all of you. Since its publication, scores of colleges and universities have publicly acknowledged their historical ties to slavery and to the slave trade. Not just in the United States, by the way, but increasingly also here in the Netherlands. Professor Wilder is also the author of the book In the Company of Black Men, The African Influence on African-American Culture in New York City, and the book A Covenant with Color, Race and Social Power in Brooklyn. Professor Wilder is a senior fellow at the Bard Prison Initiative, where he has served as a visiting professor, commencement speaker, and academic advisor. A very special initiative that has given hundreds of men and women the opportunity to earn college degrees during their incarcerations in New York State's prison system. Very noble cause. Today, Professor Wilder is here to talk to us about the Knickerbocker Renaissance, Dutch schools, and slavery in the early United States. This is the way it's going to work. Professor Wilder will give a talk that lasts roughly 30 minutes, after which I will moderate a Q&A. So for those of you listening in, please do write your questions in the Q&A in the Zoom. So not the chat, but the Q&A. And for the ones in the Netherlands, it's the V&A option at the bottom of your screen. And I will collect your questions and put them to Professor Wilder. So hope this all goes smoothly. Professor Wilder, thank you again for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Pargas. And let me also thank Caroline Neermans of NAF and Maggie, who's in the background there. I'm going to share my screen now. If the perfect. In November 1772, Philip Freneau wrote to James Madison, his former roommate at the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. Madison was also the future president of the United States. And Freneau wrote him explaining his rather short-lived first career. Quote, "Long Island I have bid adieu with all its brutish, brainless crew. The youth of that detested place are void of reason and of grace." Several months earlier, Philip Freneau had graduated with the class of 1771 at what's now Princeton. Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a Scottish immigrant who became an influential editor, author, and Pennsylvania politician, delivered a commencement address at that graduation that he co-authored with Freneau, a commencement poem. After graduation, Brackenridge planned to stay in Princeton to study theology under President John Witherspoon. Madison had also made the decision to stay in Princeton, where he was going to continue learning Hebrew under President Witherspoon. William Bradford of Pennsylvania, who was the last member of this little campus clique that Freneau was involved in, and a future United States Attorney General, was in the following graduating class. Freneau, at the point of graduation, had secured a job teaching at Flatbush in Kings County on Long Island. And it's that career I want to use to introduce the story of education in this little village. His career lasted only 13 days, less than 2 weeks. Freneau found the local children ill-prepared for any serious study. Village officials had kept him on a rather meager salary and quickly revealed themselves to be a pretty unsavory lot. As Freneau put it, some gentlemen of New York, some of them were bullies, some merchants, others scoundrels. A desperate Freneau gathered his possessions and took flight from Flatbush to Princeton, where he laid low through the start of the academic year. The Long Islanders, the Flatbush crew, were actually seeking his arrest and threatening, as he put it, that if I was caught in New York, they would either trounce or maim me. His plight actually became gossip in various towns and eating houses in the area. Quote, "From Flushing Hills to Flatbush Plains, deep ignorance, unrivaled reign," the young poet put it. Freneau feared that the rumors about his career had reached his friends, and that's one of the reasons why he was actually writing to James Madison, to sort of give him a clear sense of what had actually happened. School keeping was a serious business. Freneau actually promised to write a terrible satire upon the, as he put it, vicious persons of quality in New York who have also used me ill. And the soon-to-be poet of the American Revolution kept his word. In October 1772, he left Princeton to take a job under his friend Brackenridge, his classmate, who had become headmaster of a private school in Maryland. Quote, "We have about 30 students in this academy," Freneau was already complaining, quote, "who prey upon me like leeches." He had apparently already completed his poem, The Miserable Life of a Pedagogue, a poem about the personal necessities that had brought him to Flatbush during, and I'm quoting him, a certain crazy season when men have neither sense nor reason. As Freneau explained it, local parents, untroubled by the limits of their undisciplined, untalented children, expected him to teach the classics, learned languages, history, literature, and grammar, mathematics, and science without exposing or challenging their own superstitions and ignorance. Quote, "A plague, I say, on such employment, were neither pleasure nor enjoyment. Whoever to such a life is tied was born the day he should have died." The drama in Flatbush actually, I would suggest, responded to the collapse of a kind of traditional ecology of teaching and learning. During the prior century, cycles of growth in the African slave trade and the sprawl of plantation agriculture integrated regional and local markets, transforming education throughout the English colonies. Wealth from the Atlantic slavery actually stabilized the earliest British American colleges, Harvard, 1636, William and Mary in Virginia, founded 1693, Yale, 1701 in Connecticut. It also funded a major extension of higher education. In less than a quarter century, clerical leaders and prominent families in varied Christian denominations tripled the number of seminaries and colleges in the colonies. Codrington College in Barbados, founded 1745, the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, 1746, the College of Philadelphia, now the University of Pennsylvania, founded about 1750, King's College, now Columbia, founded 1754, the College of Rhode Island, now Brown, founded 1764, Queens College, now Rutgers University, founded in 1766, and finally Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, founded 1769. Those economic incentives also drew northern port cities and farming districts into more intense commercial relationships with the South and the West Indies. Northern smallholders, northern small farmers increased their investments in enslaved labor to meet demand for basic foodstuffs in these rice, sugar, and tobacco growing regions. Freneau's Flatbush saga avoids any mention of slavery, but the Atlantic economy staged the affair and silently directed his formative years. It produced pockets of prosperity across the mid-Atlantic and New England. Greater numbers of families began hiring private tutors, often graduates of these new colleges, such as Freneau, turning even remote rural districts into destinations for the itinerant teachers who tramped across the colonies. Protestant ministers, merchants, and farmers organized preparatory academies to supply students to the new schools, expand and unify their denominations, and raise revenue in the outlying settlements. Seeking time and inspiration to write, Freneau soon sailed for Santa Cruz, St. Croix, under the employ and patronage of John Hanson, a prominent planter, merchant, and slaveholder with ties to New York and the British and Danish West Indies. Flatbush leaders had little trouble replacing the poet. By 1774, John Copp, who had just finished King's College, now Columbia, was in town instructing a few gentlemen's children in the learned languages, but his plans to open a formal day school were stalled by the American Revolution. In 1784, just a few years after the Treaty of Paris closed the American Revolution, the New York legislature created the Regents of the University of the State of New York, and it's basically an unelected body that regulated colleges and academies. The University of the State of New York is actually not a campus or a university. It's a regulatory body. State officials were reinventing education from the remnants of an uneven colonial infrastructure, which had been upended by the war. During the next 3 years, the legislature empowered the regents to define, incorporate, and superintend educational institutions. The new state governments leaned heavily upon private academies to actually satisfy the educational needs of people in the early United States. And the logic of that is relatively clear: locally organized, self-governed, and funded by tuition and donations. Academies, private academies, allowed officials to encourage education without imposing taxes, centralizing authority, or aggravating religious and political schisms that were being healed in the aftermath of the war. An English visitor noted that private academies were actually sprouting up all over the United States, but there was probably no place in the United States that depended more heavily upon academies than New York State. As legislators were tweaking the Board of Regents, several prominent families in the little town of Flatbush in Kings County, now Brooklyn, New York, were planning a school. And the immediate aim was to resuscitate a community that had experienced several years of military occupation and economic upheaval. The Flatbush pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church, Peter Lowe, encouraged the undertaking, believing that the school would actually help to bind and unify the communion, stabilize the denomination through an era of political and social transformation, and feed students to Queens College, which I had mentioned before, the Dutch Reformed College in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which was a struggling school. The proposed academy would also serve a patchwork of Dutch New York or Knickerbocker communities that stretch from Long Island north along the Hudson. Its name, honoring the Dutch priest and liberal philosopher Erasmus, advertised a kind of practical ecumenicalism that was being practiced in the aftermath of the war. In February 1786, the Reverend John Henry Livingston and Judge John Vanderbilt called the founding meeting of Erasmus Hall. An heir to a mid-Atlantic slaving family, Reverend Livingston had graduated Yale and earned a doctorate in theology at the University of Utrecht before appointments to the pulpit of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York City and as professor of theology for the Synod. Judge Vanderbilt was a Flatbush merchant and farmer from a leading slave-owning family in New York with land holdings across the region. A revolutionary elite answered the appeal for subscriptions, for donations. Alexander Hamilton, the future Secretary of the Treasury, and a promiscuous supporter of schools, his nemesis Aaron Burr, the lawyer and financial speculator William Durr, Chancellor Robert Livingston, the jurist and ambassador John Jay, Matthew Clarkson, the revolutionary military officer, and Vanderbilt's business partner were just some of the people who actually sent money for the project. The Reformed Church in Flatbush actually donated land, a 3-acre property, kitty corner, from its church grounds, and joined the town council in auctioning off some common lands to support the project. In April 1787, the board announced that Erasmus Hall Academy was to begin classes the following month in, quote, an elegant and large building erected for that purpose. What I'd like to just point out is that there was really little in the history of the village that forecast this sort of academic renaissance. In 1654, if we go back a century and a half, the magistrates of Flatbush and Flatlands, 2 towns in Brooklyn, had petitioned General Director Peter Stuyvesant to allocate 4 town lots for a church and a school. That actually happened. Stuyvesant actually gave those lots. And the following year, the Dutch West India Company assigned a voorlezer, a officiant for the sick, to the town. The common responsibilities of that post included preaching in the absence of ordained clergy, caring for the ill, and keeping schools, but its many responsibilities or many offices could be fairly secular and mundane. For example, Carol de Beauvoir, who held this role in Brooklyn, the town of Brooklyn, filled the position of lay reader, schoolmaster, bell ringer, court messenger, and grave digger, for which he actually got additional pay. Stuyvesant had honed his managerial skills in Curacao, governing Dutch settlements plagued by food and supply shortages. And thus the schoolmaster, Jan Galgert, held the more critical position of keeper of the company's goats. By 1659, the Reformed Church in Flatbush had raised a small schoolhouse and secured a teacher, and that basically was the infrastructure for education in Flatbush and in many of the old Dutch towns of New Netherland, and even through the English era for the next century. It was the schoolhouse attached to the church. Occasionally, those schoolhouses actually had teachers. Very often, there were long gaps without instructors or instruction. To put it a little bit differently, there were lots of reasons to open a school in post-revolution New York, but few of them were actually altruistic. Médéric Louis Élie Moreau de Saint-Marie stopped Alexander Hamilton, a fellow West Indian, on a Manhattan street. Moreau was a Martinican lawyer and refugee of the French Atlantic revolutions, and he had stopped Alexander Hamilton, really asking advice on retiring his financial embarrassments. He was in a bit of debt. The United States Treasurer urged him to actually have his wife start a school. as the best way to make money and pay off what he owed. During a tour of New York, Yale President Timothy Dwight was later appalled at the absence of public schools. He blamed a weak civic culture that had never produced, and I'll quote him, anything which resembles a system. The academy model actually heightened inequalities, encouraging speculative ventures, including schools funded by stock companies. Communities or individuals could start schools really without much state supervision, producing glaring inequities and abuses. Moreau protested that local parents were, and I'll quote him, only interested in the cost of schooling and being relieved of the burden of taking care of their children. The chaos of the marketplace suppressed education and subordinated any civic aims to profiteering, Reverend Dwight of Yale charged. Quote, an individual, sometimes a liberally educated student, having obtained the proper recommendations, offers himself to some of the inhabitants as a schoolmaster. If he's approved and procures a competent number of subscribers, he hires a room and commences the business of instruction. Dwight wrote of such enterprises. Philip Freneau captured the sort of public problem of private schooling a bit more artfully. By him, a numerous herd controlled, the smart, the stupid, and the bold. He cautioned of the reciprocal disappointments of teaching and learning. He concluded, and all his pupils led astray have each found out a different way. In other words, Flatbush really had no deep academic traditions to build upon. Flatbush had slaves. Virtually all of the free families owned someone. A May 1786 census taken shortly after the first meeting of Erasmus's founders revealed Flatbush as the densest slaveholding community in New York State. Slaves were more than 46% of the population, the precise proportion of Charleston, South Carolina. There were in fact 255 white residents and 223 enslaved Black people. The enslaved easily outnumbered white adults. There were more than 4 slaves per household. The old Dutch towns of Albany, Rensselaer, and Watervliet had greater total numbers of enslaved people than Flatbush, as did the town of Brooklyn, but no locality in New York matched its concentration. In fact, Flatbush was the gravitational center of the New York slave economy, and New York was the dominant slaveholding state in the entire Northeast of the United States. There were more enslaved people in New York than in all the other northern states combined. The nascent Empire State housed 5 times as many slaves as all of New England. It followed Georgia as the nation's 5th largest slave state, with an enslaved population more than 40% larger than the Kentucky territories. Mid-Atlantic villages leveraged their access to enslaved labor, semi-rural locations, and proximity to ports and commercial routes to create a network of preparatory schools. That's what Erasmus was. Erasmus charter trustees, for example, owned more than 100 human beings, including at least a quarter of all the Black people in Flatbush. The trustees came from the most prominent slaveholding families in the county and the state: Lefferts, Livingstons, Vanderbilts, Martenses, Sidems, Provosts, Lotts, Vanderveers, and Cornells. John Vanderbilt had at least 10 enslaved people at the time that the school was founded, and his household records show outlays for Negro clothes and medical procedures on his slaves. Reverend Livingston, the founding principal, was also a slave owner. And just a couple of months after Erasmus opened, the trustee, Garrett Martens, was searching for, quote, his Negro man named Will, who talks good Low Dutch, the colonial dialect, and but poor English. It might well have been counterintuitive to open a boarding school in a farming village, sitting along an unreliable road nestled in the interior of an unevenly developed county, at a time when the state and local governments lacked funds to assist in the endeavor, and when the citizenry was preoccupied with economic and physical rebuilding after the war. It was a decision no less bold, perhaps, than the founders' determination to name the school for an early modern philosopher who professed the immorality of Christian slavery. There was an obvious gamble to the endeavor, as there is with any investment scheme. Erasmus Hall was a business. The academy provided instruction for village youth, who were the majority of its students, Susanna Martens, for instance, Mary Gifford and Minnie Shank, girls from Flatbush, were studying in the English course in the first year. In fact, one of the great achievements of the academy system was the introduction of formalized education for girls in these villages and towns. While the academy and the tuition of students from out of town underwrote the cost of providing education for kids who were from town, the boarding fees of those out-of-town students actually helped to subsidize local families. Even children from the surrounding region, from neighboring towns and counties, routinely stayed in town and returned home only on the weekends or less regularly. There was enough money to be made by housing and boarding students and taking in tuition that Mary Bassett, who is married to the Reverend Martina Schoonmaker, actually opened a hotel opposite the school. Early national newspapers carried regular advertisements for Black people who had escaped enslavement, spoke Low Dutch, often better than English, and could be identified by marks and scars. These alerts record the geography of the Dutch mid-Atlantic and Dutch mid-Atlantic slavery. John Grosbeck's Harry, a 28-year-old man, was born in Albany, escaped from New York City, and was probably heading to West Jersey. The runaway slave ad attempting to cause his capture noted that he spoke good Dutch and English and had an ankle that bent, quote, inward from a cut thereon. Sam and Bet Tunis Cools, and I'm quoting him, new Negroes, fled from West Jersey in the coarse flannel that served as their only covering when they were purchased, and some stolen clothes, as Cool put it. Sam had a large scar on his right leg. Another enslaved man, Hank, quote, speaks good English and Dutch, Barrett Ventiver of Flatbush cautioned readers, quote, and tells people he is a free Negro. Mid-Atlantic masters actually recorded the horrors of human bondage in those same ads. An early historian of Flatbush, Thomas Strong, reluctantly admitted that the townspeople erected a whipping post and hired a public whipper primarily to control, quote, the number of slaves which were then held by the several inhabitants and were kept in subjection and punished for minor offenses in this summary manner. In her History of Neighboring New Utrecht, Charlotte Beecher Bangs confessed that enslaved people were routinely placed in iron collars bearing their owners' names or initials. And, I'll quote her, each night the slaves were chained fast, whether it be in the slave kitchen, cellar, or outhouse. Moreau San Marie recalled seeing in the streets of Manhattan, quote, a little Negro who was wearing an iron chain around his neck in punishment for absenting himself from his master's house. Philip Freneau himself had actually spent his childhood on a family estate at Mount Pleasant, New Jersey, which his biographer pointed out was about 1,000 acres and with large buildings and a great number of slaves, was about as close to a southern plantation as the mid-Atlantic region could produce. Freneau had likely witnessed, in fact, or encountered all of the inhumanities of slavery, including branding, whipping, torture, and rape, as he came of age in New Jersey. It was really, however, in the Caribbean, while he was in St. Croix and traveled in the surrounding region, that he actually came to reject slaveholding and to become a major critic of the slave regime. Brutality, however, defined mid-Atlantic slavery. A historian of New Brunswick, where Rutgers or Queens College was, reported that town officials routinely jailed, and I'm quoting, stray Negroes, whom they sold off if left unclaimed. Hackensack, New Jersey residents preferred a very local means of torture. They, quote, shackled and handcuffed and sent to spend the night in the dreaded swamps of Lodi any enslaved person who dared to resist bondage. To discourage escapes, arson, and lesser mischiefs, the town leaders in Kingston, New York, lashed enslaved people discovered outside after nightfall without lighted lanterns. Albany officials actually used a kind of circuit whipping method in which they dragged enslaved people to various points in town and beat them naked across their naked backs. It was that labor system that Flatbush freeholders actually bent from agriculture toward boarding. The 1786 census recorded 51 free families, 51 free families who were holding more than 200 enslaved people during a prolonged period of economic crisis. This model was not limited to New York. What the Academy did for Flatbush was bring in scores of lodgers into these households so that these households could actually draw income during a prolonged period of economic decline. But it's not just Flatbush. In 1787, the same year that Erasmus opened, the trustees of Newark Academy, now the University of Delaware, advertised something very similar, that they were negotiating with local families to reduce boarding fees and therefore increase the number of students coming into the town. And so if we really think about what this school was doing, on the local level, the Erasmus Hall was there to help resuscitate a depressed agricultural economy in a town that was actually suffering, continuing to suffer economically in the aftermath of the war. More broadly, the Dutch Reformed Church interest in Erasmus Hall was really part of a broader plan to try and bind the Union and unify the Union as the United States made this sort of journey into nationhood, out of war and into nationhood. And I'll just quote one more time. Let me just. I beg you will not forget our institution at this place. President Jacob Hardenberg appealed to his close friends in 1790. Jacob Hardenberg was the president of Queens College, Rutgers University, the Dutch Reformed Church College in New Jersey. Rutgers was actually going through a long period of economic crisis brought on both by the war, the occupation of the campus by both British and American forces during the war, the scattering of the faculty during the war, the scattering of the students during the war, and also a Reformed church that was divided on whether or not it actually needed its own college. One of the major reasons for the college was to make a kind of claim, an institutional claim upon the new United States. But not all of the pockets of Dutch Reformed strength were invested in that project. I would just remind us that key sites in the development of American slavery were often actually key sites in the history of American education. The Mid-Atlantic Knickerbocker districts gave birth to a number of Dutch Reformed schools, including Queens College and Erasmus Hall. But those schools were largely founded in the centers of slaveholding in the Northeast. Queens College was originally founded in New Barbados in the county of Bergen, a settlement that was actually established a century earlier by immigrants from Barbados who were promised large amounts of land if they brought slaves with them. Queens never disconnected from that slave economy. And in fact, actually, as it struggled to survive, the way that it plotted its future was by finding, in fact, increasing ties and more elaborate ties to the late 18th century slave economy as it was transforming. The decision to locate a permanent campus in New Brunswick had long-term consequences. We can talk about those in the Q&A, but the key thing was that for all of these schools, the difference between surviving and not surviving was attaching to that economy. Dutch Reformed congregations aggressively defended that social structure. In November 1788, on the first anniversary of Erasmus's charter, the parishioners of the Flatbush Reformed Church debated the admission of Black members to the church. The school had just been established, and following that discussion, Father Lowe, Peter Lowe, shared his despair with a close friend, the Reverend John Bassett of the Reformed Church in Albany. Bassett could certainly empathize with Lowe. By mid-century, Albany housed more enslaved people than any other county in New York. Lowe reported that Dutch Flatbush rejected the obligation to evangelize Black people. Quote, "Negroes have no souls," his congregants protested, insisting that Black people were descendants of Ham and cursed by God. Quote, "Nauseous sweat flowed from Africans, which, as the congregants put it, combined with their complexions and manners, proved that they were a species very different from us," the Flatbush Christians cautioned. Fearing a threat to social order, white villagers embraced mastery while reflexively subordinating faith to class. These families worried that the admission of a few Black people would encourage more conversions, lead to demands for other privileges, erode the social order of slavery, and throw disrepute upon the denomination by encouraging intermixing. They imagined with horror a moment when Negro deacons might, quote, summon their masters before the consistory and hold them to account. The violent social scape of American slavery, with all its racial defenses, actually provided the foundation for American education. Within 2 years of its May 1787 opening, Erasmus Hall had 73 students, including William Ludwell Lee of the Virginia Lees, who had land and slaves waiting for him upon his return, John Scott from a prominent North Carolina plantation family, and students from Grenada, St. Thomas, and the British Virgin Islands. 3 of the slave trader and merchant John Kruger's children from New York City and St. Croix enrolled during those years, along with 5 boys from the Danish West Indies. The trustees, in fact, had so many foreign students that they brazenly petitioned New York State for a blanket exemption from, quote, training or duty in the militia in this county. By 1790, Erasmus had larger enrollments than Columbia College, now Columbia University. At least 40 of those scholars were in the college preparatory course, meaning students who were actually tuition paying and helping to support the economy of the town. The brothers John and William Lambert simply listed their home as the West Indies. There were 10 students from the Caribbean, 4 Europeans, and 7 Southerners in those classes. Those first cohorts included 2 Portuguese boys, 2 French scholars, a Jamaican, and 4 students, the Culpepers and the Brush brothers from Suriname. There were a few academies that enrolled similar across New York, but Erasmus was probably in some ways the most successful of these projects at building a kind of Atlantic slavery academy, an academy rooted in the Atlantic slave economy. International and out-of-town students traveled along the commercial routes linking the mid-Atlantic to the plantations and Europe. And that in many ways actually captures the history of the hall. The one thing I'll add is the image that you're looking at right now. Erasmus was so able to attract out-of-town students and to use those commercial networks that one of the ways that the trustees discovered they could continue making money was by teaching English to foreigners who do not understand it, which is at the bottom of that advertisement. To end, in October 1794, Moreau Sainte-Marie actually visited Erasmus Hall while touring through Kings County, the lawyer from Martinique who was escaping the French Revolution by living in New York City. Quote, the academy supposedly teaches Greek, Latin, French, arithmetic, and mathematics. He noted with a skepticism and disdain that he had rehearsed while examining the colleges in Princeton and Manhattan. During this impromptu inspection, he became intrigued with the ethnic and religious diversity of the small professional staff. Reverend Livingston had actually recruited James Todd to teach language and geography. Todd was a Scottish immigrant who had previously taught in Princeton. Todd had also taken on an assistant, a former canon from the shuttered Abbey of St. Genevieve in Paris, where thousands of soldiers had actually taught and fought during the Revolution. The ex-priest was actually likely part of the ecclesiastical exodus from France following the General Assembly's passage of the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in July 1790. What I want you to think about is actually what that meant for Erasmus Hall. While Moreau Sainte-Marie was in Erasmus Hall, he also actually documented the presence of what he described as a Negro, a Negress, and her children who were servicing the hall. To think about it then, Erasmus Hall was actually a Dutch Reformed academy under a Scottish teaching master with his former Catholic friar assistant, French Catholic friar assistant, all supported by the labor of enslaved Black people. Erasmus Hall was in many ways the Atlantic world, and the Atlantic world was largely a creation of that slave economy. I'm going to end there, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilder, for your presentation. All of this is fascinating. It does remind me a little bit of your book, Ebony and Ivy, that from a few years ago. I want to ask people at home, if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to start off with, if you don't mind. I think this is fascinating. The period you're discussing is the wake of the revolution, right? When a lot of things are in upheaval, and you also really lay this out well in your book, that it becomes sort of the rage to establish new academies of higher education, right? And what I was wondering was, during the revolution, and especially in the aftermath of the revolution, in the northern states, there is already discussion about the morality of slavery. Massachusetts, by the 1780s, Massachusetts has already abolished slavery by a court order. Pennsylvania has already passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. And then by the end of the period you were talking about, like in 1799, New York State itself passes a Gradual Emancipation Act. So these discussions are in the air at the time that this academy is being established and other academies are being established. And I'm wondering if they have any influence on the development of these academies and their dependence on slavery. Certainly their dependence on students, like you were saying, from the West Indies and the South.
Yeah, those debates certainly have an influence. And in fact, some of those debates are happening on campuses. There are anti-slavery addresses being given at, King's College, now Columbia. There are anti-slavery addresses being given at the new University of North Carolina, one of the first public universities established in the early United States. And so the revolution actually sparks a discussion about and a debate of the morality of slavery and the practicality of slavery, and its political fate on campuses across the United States. And that actually continues well into the 19th century. The suppression of anti-slavery debate and the suppression of sort of critiques of slavery largely happened in 1831 as a institutional response to the Nat Turner Rebellion from Virginia outward, where one of the responses, particularly on Southern university campuses, is to suppress any discussion of the debate and around the morality of slavery. That's one of the reasons why I find that 1788 meeting that Father Lowe writes about to his friend Father Bassett up in Albany, Father Lowe, the minister of the Flatbush Reformed Church, to his friend Father Bassett up in Albany, because it's literally happening as those debates around slavery are actually gaining momentum. And so this absolute rejection of not just anti-slavery, but simply the admission of Black people to the Reformed Church itself, drawing that harsh line. I left a quote out of that, which I probably shouldn't have. In that letter, one of the things that Father Lowe points out that his congregation says and warns him about is that if you admit Black people, all of these terrible things will happen, including them potentially holding us accountable for their enslavement and for their treatment. But they also warn him that going down this path would actually lead the Reformed Church down the path to what they describe as, and I'm quoting, downright Methodism. Right, and so they not only reject it, but they actually find a theology for rejecting it.
Right, Methodism sounds like the worst thing that could happen to these people.
Right. To good Calvinist, yes.
Exactly. Well, sort of following up on that, I have another question. So when the Dutch Reformed Church is clearly not open to admitting Black congregants at this time. They're very hesitant to speak out, certainly against slavery, because they're not. These students, at least some of them, let's say the students from the South, probably, and students from the West Indies, are are they bringing enslaved people with them? I have heard stories of this happening at other colleges throughout the country. And if so, and certainly there are also local enslaved people just from Flatbush who are sort of working and doing a lot of the work in the college itself. Um, isn't there any concern of these people, how to put it, like learning the same things that are being taught to these elite white students? I mean, they're being taught, they're being taught in history. I saw modern history. They're being taught the classics, presumably also theology. Erasmus, I guess, since the hall is named after him. These are dangerous ideologies, maybe for enslaved people to hear. Is there any talk about that?
There is, but there's also a fascinating history here. We tend to think that the presence of enslaved people is something that happens in the United States, in Southern colleges, campuses, university buildings, etc. In fact, actually, there were lots of enslaved people on Northern campuses and colleges. Harvard has identified dozens and dozens and dozens. Yale has identified dozens and dozens. We know that, for instance, James Madison, when he goes to Princeton, arrives with his enslaved man Swanee. George Washington brings his stepson, Jackie Custis, to what's now Columbia University in New York with his enslaved man, Joe, who moves into the college building to serve his son during the 2 years that he's in school. And so enslaved people were on campuses all the time. And then this question of learning, there is some concern about learning, and actually certainly the criminalization of literacy that begins in the Southern states in the mid-18th century actually then gets reinforced after the Nat Turner Rebellion, another effort to suppress all anti-slavery discussion and debate is a second wave or another wave of anti-literacy laws in the United States. But we know, for example, and I'll take us off this topic for just a second, at MIT, the founder of MIT, William Barton Rogers, had begun his career as a professor in the South at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and then at the University of Virginia. He owned 6 enslaved people when he left Virginia in 1853 to come to Massachusetts to build his idea of a polytechnic school, a technical school, originally in Boston. Among the enslaved people whom he owned in Virginia was a woman named Isabella Gibbons, who he had leased and then purchased. And we know that she actually secretly taught her children to read, and that her husband, William Gibbons, was enslaved by another faculty member in another building, used his access to that faculty member's library to instruct himself, and then basically eavesdropped on student debates, discussions, and study sessions to enhance his academic, his access to that kind of education. And so there are lots of these examples. Betsy Stockton at Princeton, who's owned and held enslaved in the president's house, an enslaved Black woman who actually teaches herself biblical geography using the president's library and becomes, in fact, an extraordinary source for lots of academics on the geography of the Bible. She also develops an extraordinary facility with languages and becomes a Presbyterian missionary after she's freed. And so, yeah, there are lots of these examples. There are examples in engineering and the sciences. There's a young man at what's now the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis who purchases his freedom by building steam engines for midshipmen and selling them to midshipmen. And that's how he raises the money to become free. He taught himself mathematics while in the employ of a faculty member at the Naval Academy.
That's fascinating to me. I mean, I always thought that, I had heard some of these kinds of stories before. And of course, literacy, that's a major one. Also very dangerous for the institution of slavery, for enslaved people to learn to read and write. And, I always thought perhaps it was something like, obviously, a lot of the ideology that defends slavery, that justifies slavery, and even some of the ideology that doesn't defend slavery, tends to portray Black people at this time as being incapable of higher learning.
Right.
And so maybe that they were sort of careless enough to allow, let's say, their servants into the classrooms, obviously thinking that they probably won't understand what we're talking about anyway. And
well,
this is something that comes back to bite them.
One of the fascinating things about that point is that I would also add that lots of colleges and universities, they can't avoid using enslaved labor, or to put that differently, they're extraordinarily dependent upon enslaved labor, particularly in the sciences and engineering, which are labor-intensive occupations where you need research assistants, lab assistants, et cetera. Enslaved people are often in those capacities. Again, I'll turn to the founder of MIT. He held an enslaved man named Levi, who operated as his research assistant when he did geological research in the Virginias. And Levi was so important to William Barton Rogers' career that Levi also actually substituted for Rogers when Rogers couldn't be present. For example, he took a famous French geographer, Levi took a famous French geographer on a geographical tour of the Virginias in Rogers' absence, right? And we actually have lots of examples of enslaved people who are doing the heavy central work of knowledge production at American colleges and universities, and that story has largely been erased from academic histories.
Yeah, that's definitely a point that deserves more attention among scholars. I'd like to press a little bit more about curriculum, because these colleges, you made a very convincing argument that these colleges are dependent upon the Atlantic slave economy. They're also dependent upon slavery in a very personal capacity. Locals, the local community is very much a slaveholding community. Locals are opening up their houses as boarding houses to students and using slave labor to help run those houses. The donors, I expect the donors, the trustees are all slaveholders and are all basically reallocating profits procured from slavery to help finance this college. But what about the curriculum? Do you know anything about maybe details about what was taught there? Does the curriculum devote any attention at all to, let's say, justifying white supremacy, slavery, colonialism in general, especially since I saw that modern history was on the curriculum?
Yeah, if you're talking about the Erasmus Hall curriculum, the Erasmus Hall curriculum is basically stratified. There's a curriculum for the kids from town, which is the sort of English language curriculum, prepping them for the trades and citizenship, largely prepping them to become landowners in Flatbush and the surrounding towns, and efficient farmers. And then there's the academic course. The English language course is also the girls' curriculum for the school. The academic course is rooted in Latin, Greek, and philosophy, and it's supposed to prep the boys, and particularly privileged boys, for entrance into college and university. And so the modern history component there is actually largely Western European history and the history of Christianity. The debates about slavery, or the education about slavery that question sort of really is focused on, actually does happen at a lot of colleges and universities on both sides of the Atlantic. And so when I was working on the book project, one of the things I was really interested in was tracing how race got taught at colleges and universities. And then what did students learn? So what did the professor's lecture say? And then what did the student's notebook say? And there's some examples where you can actually find those things coming together. For the most part, race was treated as a kind of scientific project, an effort to prove the validity of an idea, which involved philosophers, scientists, and to some extent theologians. There are rarer examples of, but still discoverable, of faculty who actually introduced their critique of slavery into the college curriculum. And that certainly does happen. It doesn't
That was a
happen.
lot.
It doesn't happen at Erasmus.
Right.
Certainly does happen. Yeah.
We do have a question from the chat, from the Q&A. Two questions. First one is, which US university was the first to admit Black students? Do we know what they majored in and what careers they pursued after graduation?
Yes, this is a tricky question because there's a right answer, and a right answer, and so
Okay.
you can't get the right answer. I think the first school to actually graduate a Black student, if I remember correctly, is Middleburg College up in Vermont. But Black students had actually been given access to American universities going back to the 18th century, largely the Revolutionary era, when a number of college presidents actually took in individual Black students for private study, often actually under a kind of, early sort of project of seeing if and experimenting with the idea of Black education. And so that happens at Princeton. It happens at a number of schools where one Black student will be actually admitted for private study. And that model had continued into the 1820s when the first Black students to actually get college degrees enter and complete the undergraduate course.
Okay, so that's the right answer and the right answer.
About 4 or 5 students who actually managed to graduate during that period. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Another question coming from the chat is there a Dutch connection? Is there a connection to the Dutch heritage of these towns and their willingness to teach girls, or is the teaching of girls inspired by what scholars have called Republican motherhood?
Yeah, I think I'm imagining it's a bit of both. This is one of the things I've been kind of tracing. It seems to me that the argument about republicanism actually makes a lot of sense when you look at New York State, when you pull the lens out and look statewide. One of the great triumphs of the academy model is the introduction of education for white girls. It is also true that the academy model thrived, and this was one of the reasons I started working on this essay. The academy model thrived in places where the slave economy was centered, right? And so if you think about a lot of the early academies, Kingston Academy, Kinderhook in New York, Erasmus, all of them are actually in the most dense slaveholding part of their county, right? Mm-hmm. So the academies give you a perfect experiment in the intimacy of the relationship between academia and unfreedom. And the other part of that is the Dutch part of that is because the Dutch remain, Knickerbocker, New York Dutch, remain heavily concentrated in agriculture. They are actually, the Dutch strongholds are these sort of dense slaveholding sections of New York State and to some extent New Jersey. But largely New York State, the Hudson Valley, sweeping out toward east toward across Long Island. And so you actually have a sort of perfect picture of that relationship in those tiny little academic villages.
That was the answer to my final question. Honestly, how Dutch is this story? Certainly in New York State, it sounds like this is a very Dutch story. The link between these academy models.
It's very much a Dutch story in New York. And again, the relationship between the Knickerbocker Dutch and the Dutch is something one could write about for years. And it's something I've been working on actually for the last year or two, because there are lots of ways to sort of, that group is in such radical transformation by this time period. Intermarriage, the collapse of the Dutch language, even within Dutch Reformed churches, just after the period that we're talking about, Dutch will stop being used. In many of these Dutch Reformed churches, intermarriage, and then in fact the increasing complications of the Atlantic economy will pull the Dutch out of these sort of change these agricultural pockets.
Thank you very much. We have one final comment I see in the Q&A, and then we'll have to wrap it up. This is from Stephen Staggs. I really appreciate Dr. Wilder's work. His research and writing unsilenced the past Like Dr. Wilder, I've dug into the history of the Erasmus Hall Academy. There were 115 books donated to Erasmus by the State Board of Regents in 1791. Among the most popular and influential were two of the standard textbooks, Samuel Johnston's A Dictionary of the English Language and Oliver Goldsmith's A History of the Earth and Animated Nature. Both explicitly reinforce the assumed supremacy of whites. So just to go back to the whole curriculum issue that we were talking about. Okay, we are going to have to wrap it up. Professor Wilder, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to enlighten us on this. You were talking about the relationship between the Knickerbocker Dutch and the Dutch. Is this a book project that you are currently working on?
It's related to a number of things that I've been working on, one of which is sort of the how the history of slavery in New York gets reconstructed and rewritten in the aftermath of the American Revolution, which requires, in fact, a deep engagement with New York's Dutch past. And so, you know, how do you wrestle with the story of slavery in New York State in the 19th century? One of the ways that you do it is by going back to New Netherland and reinventing New Netherland in order, in many ways, to rescue New York from the problem of slavery in its history.
Right. Okay, then we are definitely going to have you back on, or back over here to the Netherlands to talk to us about your current work. That's great.
I look forward.
Okay,
thank you for the invitation. It was.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar, and thanks to everybody at home for participating. We will organize another webinar together with the NUF next October, so stay tuned for that. Thanks very much to all of you for attending.